Born May 9, 1951, U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo is a renowned poet, musician, playwright, and author of her time, using arts as both a means of therapy as well as to speak about activism in her very own Native American culture. Within her culture and the world, she is seen as the first Native American to hold the honor of United States poet. She's also a member of the Muscogee Nation, a tribe based in Oklahoma that descends from the Muscogee Confederation, which is a large group of the indigenous peoples. She's also an important figure in the second wave of the literary Native American Renaissance of the late 20th century in her contribution to art in both her culture and expansion of Native American recognition throughout the world. As well as being a major figure in art recognition, she's also taught in numerous United States universities, as well as performed internationally, for poem readings and music events, releasing 7 albums of her very own. Like her, I also find myself dedicated to developing my own understanding and contributions to the arts, both through writing, not really poems, but pieces, and my own art production. At some point, like Harjo, I want to learn how to tell stories and messages in my art. In Harjo's case, though, her most prominent and significant artistic contributions, mainly those she's been awarded for, are her devotion and production within the field of literature, music, and most importantly, poetry. In her time, this renowned writer has produced Poet War in 2021, An American Sunrise in 2019, Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings in 2015, Crazy Brave in 2012, and How We Became Human, New and Selected Poems, published in 2004. The most important of her writing pieces, though, has to be the story of Crazy Brave, the story of her childhood and growing up. It includes chronicles of her life, thoughts, emotions, dreams, and memories, as well as how the absence of love between her parents is what let her form the coping strategies to conquer the hurt she's experienced later in life from domestic violence. In her life, art became a form of comfort to her, allowing for her to express and assess the things she endured, as well as find a way to make her way through them. The power of poetry is a prominent idea within this book, and thus expressed in Harjo's life herself. The timeline of this book, interestingly enough, is not linear, for she reflects on the wisdom she's learned later in life and applies it to her very own experiences, creating a way not to heal her external issues but her own internal turmoil as well. When she was younger, her mother and biological father had a difficult and oftentimes abusive marriage, something that scared young Harjo. These wounds went on to further impact Harjo later in life, shaping what and how she was able to deal with issues as they came about. When her mother eventually remarried, though, after learning of these strategies, she was tasked with having to deal with an even more abusive stepfather, one who was the main source of her family's internal and external trauma. Even within her own memoir, Harjo's younger sibling had said that the violence that had been bolstered and initiated by their stepdad was heavily downplayed, insinuating a living situation and a family dynamic that was all but good for her at the time. In reviews of Crazy Brave, people have said that she transitions between time and space with delicate ease, moving on a linear track that follows her life but deviates excellently from it just as much, shaping who she went on to become. Not only was the literature a means of solace for her throughout her life, but also a way to communicate a beautiful sort of comfort, for even if her upbringing was painfully awful and undeniably horrendous and traumatic, she was taught to find joy in her work, something that stems from the appreciation of art within her own culture and that will always be a part of her. On the topic of Harjo's music, she's been awarded multiple accolades for her work in the music industry, and she finds playing music and the saxophone to be a way to reach into people's hearts. Since childhood, being given the chance to truly connect with people isn't something that she's really had. So, in being able to do this through the music she plays, telling stories in the chords and notes and the rhythms is something that she couldn't have even dreamed to do in her youth. As said in Crazy Brave, her childhood was traumatic, thus, this wasn't really an outlet for her there, similar to the way poetry wasn't either. In her youth, her creativity was stunted before it could ever grow, due to blockage in her own family life that prevented time for herself outside of her family and their own issues. And yet, she was able to get out of such a hindering environment when she was able to get out of such a hindering environment was she able to truly flourish, and learn how to deal with the issues that came up with growing in such a way. Last is Harjo's poetry, something that not only was a means of comfort for her, but also a source of inspiration for her writing of Crazy Brave. One of her most popular and important poems that tells the story of both her culture and the most traumatizing moments in her life and her people is the poem I Give You Back. One important note about this poem is the way that Harjo speaks to fear as if it's a person, because it's been so rooted essential in her life that it's almost like a companion of sorts to her, one that's both hated and loved. Because, at the end of the day, she recognizes this emotion, this fiery and yet cool sort of negativity, as an extension of herself and her own mind. She starts the poem, interestingly enough, by not expositioning her relationship with this fear. Yet she simply says she releases both this beautiful and terrible fear, something that, like a twin, was both beloved and hated. It's interesting that this is her word choice, and melancholy as well, but it shows how deeply this emotion has become a part of her. It's hard to hate a part of herself, but at the same time, it isn't something she wants. She has a complicated relationship with this negativity, because in letting go, she's losing a part of herself, something that's been by her side for so long. Yet now, she can no longer come to find it as her own, nor that of herself. She's returning this fear back to where its roots were planted, within the violence and chaos that resulted in culture and people being so disrespected. She says she returns it back into the hearts of the white soldiers who terrorized, demonized, and dehumanized her and her culture, and in returning this fear to them, she allows the scenes that have haunted her since the beginning to seep from her. No longer do they tie to her, nor are they bound to her anymore, because all they did was give her the opposite of what she wanted. She says they kept her frozen in the naked of winter, and they smothered her in blankets in the summer, a feeling of suffocating and undeniable discomfort and pure agony that can only be expressed through certain emotions, or what she is, because she understands that she's simply a person in her own right, and fear has no right to make her feel as though she'd been less than that. Fear had such a grasp on her, but it was she who gave it the leash. It was she who gave it such an immense power, but she would allow that no longer. She wouldn't let it keep her bound any longer than it had, nor let it hurt her like a knife that she allowed it to have the possession of, or to let it broil her like meat on a spit, powerless to what was cooking it. She was no longer paralyzed with fear in a way, because the fear would have no control over her anymore, and she emphasized that. She would no longer let it follow her like a shadow that never went away, living in every pore and crevice of her mind and body, and encapsulating her in a cocoon of sorrow and intense negativity that made the mere mention of such things result in a breakdown. My heart, my heart, my heart, my heart, she says, putting emphasis and attention on how the fear weighed on her poor, poor heart, bringing it down until it no longer felt full. Until emotions other than fear felt hollow and untrue, she was doing this for her own emotional state, and for the state of her own heart and emotional health. The trauma would no longer have the ability to bring her down so immensely, because she would no longer allow the fear to define her. Because Harjo realized something, which is perhaps the strongest ending to any poem I've read. Harjo is alive and not afraid, but fear is not, and yet it is still so afraid to die. This choice of word is interesting, because in being simply alive, not weighed down by the fear, she's killing it, because fear can only thrive when you allow it to, and she would no longer allow it to be the thing that lives within her mind, because, unlike her, it's dependent on the fear to be alive, and she's not. She understands how to live outside of her negativity, and yet the fear that she speaks about cannot. In conclusion, Joy Harjo is a figure who, even in her difficult life, has thrived in an environment that has tried to bring her down. Throughout her life, she's faced the issues of being lesser than everyone else, but she realizes that does not have to be the thing that hinders her performance. Through her abusive and traumatic childhood and early 20s, she's found ways to cope, ways that went on to be a source of comfort for various other people as well. In her music, literature, and especially her poetry, she's learned to speak in a way that can communicate in people's hearts, shock them, but in the most important way, help them. This is why she's received so many accolades, because, as an artist, she's managed to tell messages and stories that not only help her own people, but the entirety of the world as well. Thank you.